I began about 30 years ago to ask a question that most people never ask about the great classics of Western and Eastern literature: philosophy, science, religion, and the arts. And even the great generals and statesmen and inventors and people of all walks of life. And I ask if any of these great men, who we all regard as famous and eminent and respected men of Western and Eastern thought, I ask if any of them have described clearly the experience of pure consciousness. And that research question became a seed that began to blossom and to flower over the years. And much to my surprise, I found that the experience of pure consciousness is described by many of the greatest men and women of the East and the West. And pure consciousness, the three-in-one structure of pure consciousness, the sequential emergence of the many from the one, the infinity collapsing to its point, cosmic consciousness, God consciousness, unity consciousness, the whole mapping of higher states of consciousness that Maharishi has brought out has cast a totally new light on the entire history of civilization, East and West. And instead of seeing Eastern and Western civilization as two contrary and opposite and irreconcilable divisions in the human sphere, what I have been finding is that East and West are completely meaningless distinctions, because the great minds of the West as well as the East have clearly described the same states of consciousness. I first became aware of this probably reading Aristotle, when I found that when you properly translate his basic themes in Book 12 of the Metaphysics, that he was not just describing a theoretical, hypothetical, conjectural God. When he talks about God, he uses exactly the terms that we understand to describe pure consciousness. It's one, it's simple, it's eternal, it's unbounded. It's a state of rest, it's a state of bliss. It's a state in which knower and known are identical. It's a state in which consciousness is conscious of itself. For centuries, this has not been known because of mistranslations. The key words that Aristotle uses have been translated as thought, thinking about thinking. The Western scholars, who are very good scholars, but they don't know about the deeper level of the mind, the level of the mind that's beyond thinking, beyond activity, in the silence of pure consciousness. And because they don't know about it, when they come across a Greek word like nous, N-O-U-S, they translate it as thought. And noesis, they translate it as thinking. So that God, who Aristotle clearly says is simple and unchanging for eternity, gets translated as thought, thinking about thinking. It's a complete mess. And that's the way scholarship stands pretty much today, in a complete absence of any real understanding of what Aristotle was, or Plato, or any of the Greeks, or the Vedic tradition was about. And so with our knowledge, with Maharishi's knowledge and the map that he's given us of the whole territory of higher states of consciousness, we can all of us have a better position, we're in a better position to understand the great classics than even the most erudite and respected scholars of the West, because they simply lack that clear paradigm and they lack the experience. And so there's just not a basis for real deep understanding of Aristotle or Plato or anybody else. So as I began to read Aristotle, I found these very precise descriptions of pure consciousness, but there was also a question: does he actually talk about experience? Does he say he has experienced it? Well, I came across a remarkable passage, in fact 3 or 4 passages, in which he says, this is a state we enjoy in our best moments. And God is permanently in this state. And if God is permanently in this state, it's a state we can be in I'll read you the quote in a minute and get it exact. But he says basically that we can be in the state that God is in eternally in our best moments. And then I found Spinoza talking about the same eternal, one, infinite, unbounded being, and saying that we know by experience that we are eternal. We know by experience that we are eternal. What kind of experience? Well, most people have no clue what kind of experience he's talking about. And we know, we all have that perspective that there's the experience that comes through impressions of the senses, and then there's a very different kind of experience that comes when we close our eyes and we settle the mind and there are no impressions of the senses or thinking present. And the mind simply is awake in itself and knows itself in a state of pure consciousness. So after I saw Aristotle and Spinoza were very clearly identifying the main properties of pure consciousness, I said, now this is way beyond the pale of what Western philosophers think. Most philosophers are convinced that all the philosophers were doing rational thinking, and they were thinking about things and creating speculative systems and worldviews, and they were giving their opinions. That's the way philosophy is regarded in the universities today, and pretty much 99.99%. But the truth about history of Western philosophy is that almost, I won't say all because that would frighten you away, but many of the great minds of the West, as well as the East, describe pure consciousness precisely in the terms that Maharishi uses, and they say or imply they had the experience. Now, in order to check myself and do a reality check, I thought I better set out criteria for what counts as a description of pure consciousness. So I made up a list of the properties of pure consciousness that Maharishi has identified over the years. And in fact, this is only a partial list. There's a much larger list of 108 properties. These are descriptive terms and phrases that Maharishi has used over countless years to describe pure consciousness. And you all recognize them. They're very familiar. You don't need to repeat them really. It's one, simple, unchanging. It's silent. It's a state of rest. It's unmanifest. It's quiet, settled, still, same over time. It's evenness, undifferentiated, and so on. And then starting at the top of the second column, we get the properties that identify it as something not just in the mind, but something that's eternally at the foundation of things. It's eternal, unbounded, unlimited, all-pervading, infinite, vast, indivisible, continuous, unconditioned, primordial, cosmic, universal, invincible, indestructible, immortal, uncreated, and so on. And then the third column, those are the qualities of it as a state of consciousness that identify it as the I, the self, or consciousness. Three equivalent terms. It's called pure wakefulness or pure subjectivity. It's eternally conscious of itself, and the knower and the knower. The knower is a state is knowing itself, and it's a pure self-referral or self-knowing. It's the identity of the knower and the known. Empty of content, awareness without an object, perfect clarity, and so on. And the fourth column is what we call the value terms or axiological terms. It's bliss, unconditioned joy, highest happiness, eternal peace, unlimited creativity, infinite organizing power, and so on. You probably all know these as well or better than I do. So I set this out as a list of criteria that could be used to identify descriptions of pure consciousness. So I had two criteria. Do they use a subset of that list to describe pure consciousness? And do they say explicitly or imply they had the experience? So what I found over the last 30 years of research, and it was a mind-blowing journey a voyage of discovery that it just really is so outside the realm of Western understanding of things, that I found over time about 325 of the most famous people in the East and West have described this in some degree of clarity and purity. Aristotle is one of the clearest. As I said before, Jesus probably gives the longest list of properties characterizing pure consciousness. In works that he gave, in teachings he gave to his disciples and that were written down, but that have since been lost and found again and denied by the mainstream people who don't really follow his teaching at all in a very full way. Plato, Aristotle, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, Whitehead, I could go on and on for 325 more. The point is that Maharishi is not to be understood as an Eastern thinker, as an Eastern representative, but as someone who has uncovered for us the deeper meaning of our own intellectual, philosophical heritage and made it available in a very simple and easy form throughout the world. So that's one thing I take away from this, that Maharishi has been radically misunderstood as someone representing an Eastern point of view. It may be true that the Eastern texts, the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, the Yoga Sutras, describe more Brahman and unity than the West, but there are people in the West that describe Brahman and unity. And the Yoga Sutras surely are about transcending and pure consciousness and cosmic consciousness. So there's no real distinction. It's just that if you know the 7 states and you look at the different thinkers from all different traditions, what you see is that they can all be fit very easily into, well, this man was talking about pure consciousness, or this man was talking about cosmic or God or unity consciousness, or this man was describing the sequential emergence of the many from the one, or the 3-in-1 structure and how the 3-in-1 structure interacts with itself. And all those things that Maharishi has brought out so brilliantly and clearly for us can be found very, very clearly said in the great works of the West as well as the East. So this idea that East is East and West is West, and then never till the two shall meet, that's just mythology. It's not true. East and West really do meet on the ground of a proper understanding, a full understanding of the 7 states of consciousness. Maharishi's analysis of consciousness is universal. It describes the experience of people in all cultures. It describes the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Mesopotamians' experience, who all describe pure consciousness, and they all say or imply they had the experience. It describes the earliest Greeks, the pre-Socratics, the later Roman philosophers, the Christians, the Islamic Sufis, the Judaic tradition. The Renaissance was a resurgence of interest in this very topic of transcending and the experience of pure consciousness. And the 17th century science grew out of it. And even the great inventors like Tesla and Ford and Edison and Lindbergh, and it goes on and on. There's just wherever you find a great man or woman in history, you find it's very, very likely that they describe. That became my guide, is that the greater the person, the more likely they had described pure consciousness or some of the higher states of consciousness. And so one way to look at this is an analysis of greatness. Where does greatness come from? Where does greatness spring from? It comes from that refinement of the nervous system, that refinement of consciousness that comes through transcending and that brings out the experience of the eternal, infinite, unbounded wholeness of things. It's gained through a very simple practice, and I'll call it the practice of transcending, to make it general enough, because Descartes and Plato and dozens of people have talked about a technique. And they've described it in such a way that, yes, you would recognize it as a technique that probably was very effective at getting the experience. Not as precisely the same as our transcendental meditation technique, but very, very clearly recognizable as a technique. And I'll give you a little bit of Plato's in a moment. So this was the list, the criteria that I used, plus the criterion, do they say they had experienced it? And using that criteria, I think I was able to achieve a very reasonable demonstration that this knowledge that Maharishi has brought out, the Vedic knowledge, is found in somewhat fragmented form, or not quite so pure form, in some cases very pure form, in all of the major traditions and cultures of East and West. So that's what I've been doing over the years. It's been a main focus over a long time, and it's enormous fun doing this. I can't tell you. Every time I pick up a new book, and I'm wondering, does this person? He's a very great, well-known poet, or just most recently, I was reading Edgar Allan Poe, and I thought, well, now he's surely, not everybody does it. Not everybody has had the experience. And then I just found it so beautifully expressed. I mean, just so clearly expressed. And again and again and again, that's been my experience. That there's only been one or two people that I thought I should find, and I couldn't find an expression of experience or pure consciousness, and out of several hundred. So that's the background. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Vedic tradition and the Greeks. And I will say, I don't know, hopefully you don't look on the internet to find out when the Vedic tradition was, because you get these really weird dates of, like, the Rig Veda was written in 1800 or 1600, and the Gita was written in BC, and the Gita was written in 500 AD, and it's very crazy. I recently found a man, his name is Dr. Achar. He's a physicist at a university in the U.S. who has used computer software, stargazing software, astronomy software, to identify the descriptions of the night sky that Vyasa gives in the Mahabharata. And there are things that Vyasa says. He says at one point that Mars was at Aldebaran, and this planet was here, and this planet was there. And lots of different, very precise descriptions of the night sky. So Achar took those descriptions and he searched the night sky back 5,000 years to find when Mars was at Aldebaran. And he found like 78 instances, and then he searched those to find when there were two full eclipses within 2 weeks, which can happen under very unusual circumstances. And he narrowed it down until he found a date. The date he found was 3067 BCE, 5,000 years ago, and that's precisely the date Maharishi gives to the Mahabharata in, I think, the introduction to the Gita, or the Science of Being. And the idea is that the Mahabharata is 5,000 years ago. That puts the whole Vedic tradition far, far earlier than that. Now, most scholars today can't fathom that, and most archaeologists, Indologists, and most people just find it unbelievable because it's so far outside the range of what we've been thinking. But this is the first hard evidence that I've seen that really helps to date the Vedic tradition. And there were scholars in the 19th century who also used that kind of astro-archaeological data to date the Brahmanas, and they put them in the 4th millennium BCE. So there is a lot of evidence. I think it's good evidence that puts the Vedic tradition very ancient. So that what happened is that the Vedic tradition was a kind of wellspring, a source, and that the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians and the Israelis and the Greeks and the Romans all were like branches of the Vedic tree. The root is the Rig Veda. The trunk is all the branches, all the 40 branches of Vedic literature. And then the Vedic tradition branched out sometime after the Gita and the Mahabharata in the around 3000 BC. And you find then expressions of it in Egypt and Mesopotamia, very, very clear expressions of it, of this knowledge. I don't think that they were copying the Vedic tradition. I don't suggest that they were just using the same terms. I think they had a technique and that they were having an experience, and they gave it their own form of expression. One of the most exciting parts of my discovery, my voyage of discovery, was to find the ancient Egyptians. The Papyrus of Ani is a very ancient text that was, I think, from the 17th dynasty. It was somewhere around 1500 BC. And I was reading it, and I kept finding these beautiful expressions of the infinite, eternal light of God, and I thought, wow, this sounds very like, it could be a description of pure consciousness. Infinite, eternal, unbounded, but I couldn't find any reference to experience. And then one day I was reading, and I found, there it was. I have collected myself like a beautiful golden hawk. You can just picture a hawk coming in for a landing and collecting itself on a tree. I have collected myself. I have settled myself. There it was. I have settled myself. That's how you know that they were not talking theory, they were talking experience, because it came from settling the mind. And that's, of course, how the Vedic tradition describes the Yoga Sutras, the classic description of transcending, describes transcending as settling of the activity of the mind. And we would add, while the mind remains awake, the settling of the activity of the mind. So, it is in the Greek tradition. And the Greeks, we don't know how exactly it came into Greece, but we do know that there were people who came to Athens at the time of Socrates and who met with Socrates, people from India. There are 5 different ancient accounts of people who had come in, who had come to India come to Greece from India, and the clear what I want to say is that there's not exactly a clear route that we can trace a technique coming into Greece, but we certainly can see that Greece had very precise descriptions of pure consciousness permeating the earliest pre-Socratic tradition through Proclus in 585 AD. So let's just jump into to Greece. The Greek philosophical tradition, called the Pre-Socratics, began 585 BC is the date that's commonly given, because Thales, who was the first, predicted an eclipse in that year, and that's how we know, that's how we date it. 585 begins the Greek tradition, and this, you have to realize, is 2,500 years after that date of 3000 BCE that was the Mahabharata, the end of the classical golden age and the beginning of Kali Yuga in the Vedic tradition. So the Vedic tradition was it's as ancient to the Greeks as the Greeks are ancient to us. 2,500 years ago for the Greeks, and for the Veda was 2,500 years ago for the Greeks. And well, first I just want to say, one of my lead-ins into the Greeks is to ask the question, how can we explain this brilliant creativity that we find in Greece? Greece is regarded as the birthplace of Western civilization. The Veda is the birthplace of Eastern, or civilization, if you will. But Greece was the birthplace of Western civilization. I think everybody in the West agrees to that. It's just sublime beauty poured out of Greece in the form of its sculpture, its temple architecture, its face painting, its drama, its philosophy. Even democracy and the Olympic Games came out of Greece. I think you all know this, so it's not a big deal. But what's interesting is that Greece, this magnificent creativity that many scholars have called the glory of Greece, hasn't been explained. How did it happen? What caused it? And so my question is, what can explain this glory of Greece? And we might also ask what could explain this glorious outburst of creativity in the Vedic tradition, the Upanishads, the Yoga Sutras, the Brahma Sutras, all the 40 branches of literature. That creativity was an explosion of creativity in the ancient world. It was just like, most scholars think it just came out of nowhere. It came out, as we will see, of the experience of transcending. Now, I just want to mention about the bronze statue there from Delphi, from the 5th century, is called the charioteer of Apollo. Now, you've heard the expression, Brahman drives the chariot? Well, here's Apollo, the god of light, the light of God. And according to ancient legend, Apollo drives the chariot across the heavens every day. Apollo drives the chariot. Interesting. It's almost a Vedic expression, isn't it? Apollo represents, among other things, light and wholeness and the source, the organizing power behind all activity. Athena, the goddess of wisdom. The Greeks built this magnificent temple on the Acropolis, the Parthenon, to honor Athena, goddess of wisdom, the virgin goddess of wisdom. And Athena, as Plato describes wisdom, can be understood as life established in the eternal, in eternal self-knowledge, immortality, and wholeness. Health, wholeness, immortality. That's how Plato describes wisdom in the dialogue called the Charmides. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So that the Greek gods, as the philosophers understood them, were personifications of the qualities of consciousness, of pure consciousness, of unbounded pure consciousness. Plato defines wisdom as this, in the following: when returning into herself, the soul, the self, passes into the other world, the region of purity and eternity and immortality and unchangeableness, and being in communion with the unchanging is unchanging, and this state of the soul is called wisdom. Now, clearly he's talking about a state that is unchangeable, immortal, eternal. Where is such a state experienced? Not through the senses. Never through the senses do we experience anything unchangeable and immortal. Everything that we know through the senses, from galaxies to protons, decay. There's nothing stable in the relative. Nothing stable in the relative. Even quarks and leptons are excited states of an underlying field. They're just vibrations in a field. Ephemeral, transitory vibrations in a field. Where do you find something eternal and unchanging? How do you get to it? Only in transcending and going beyond the finest level of thinking, the most subtle level of thought, to that unchanging silence at the basis of all thought. And this is what I find most interesting about this discovery that so many people are describing pure consciousness, is that when you go beyond pure, and when you transcend and go completely beyond thinking and all mental activity, everybody who has had that experience describes it in the same way, using that same set of terms, or a subset of that same master list of terms. When you get down and program very, very deep and get beyond thinking and activity, and all thought ceases and becomes quiet, what remains is simple, unchanging, unbounded, eternal. And that's exactly what Plato was talking about. And all of Plato's dialogues, from the middle dialogues, from the Republic, and from the Symposium, Charmides, Republic, Phaedo, Phaedrus, on, describe that eternal, unchanging state of being. I said that Plato described transcending also. Plato uses the language, by the way, of direct experience. He often talks, I've collected about 6 or 8 places where he talks about the state of eternal being as something we behold or we experience or we know it when the mind is in a state of rest. But Plato also goes on to, especially in the Charmides, this dialogue that so few people read or even know about, he describes transcending, and he uses exactly the Vedic terms to describe it. And his main phrases for describing transcending are go within. He talks about the return of the self upon the self. The Vedic expression from the Rig Veda is nivartatvam, return, go back, come home you cows, come home from the senses to the self. And that refrain goes on in the Rig Veda, and it's about Maharishi has rightly pointed out, I think, it's about transcending. And it's the classic ancient Vedic, it's the classic ancient expression for coming back, return. And Plato uses the same, return to the... He talks about the return of the self upon the self. And you might think this is a bit of a red herring, but Plotinus and Proclus pick up on that return of the self and make it their main theme and talk about transcending in terms of the return of the self. Plato talks about collecting the self into itself alone and gathering the self into itself by itself and remembering who we ultimately are, awakening the knowledge asleep within us, withdrawing from the senses and coming back to the self, freeing the self at one point he talks about freeing the self of the leaden weights that attach it to the body. Beautiful expression for stress. And purifying the barnacles that attach the self to the body in stony accretions. Beautiful, huh? You think he knew what he was talking about? He had probably had some unstressing himself. Behold, he uses the language of beholding that which is eternal and unchangeable, gaining wisdom and immortality and wholeness, knowing the self, the seeing that sees itself, the knowing that knows itself. And the Charmides has these amazing passages where he talks about a state of hearing that hears itself, a state of seeing that sees itself. He says it sees itself and it sees things as well, but it also sees itself. And he talks about a knowing that knows itself and knows other things as well. A knowing that knows itself, what could that be? Well, consciousness that's conscious of itself. And he talks at one point about bringing the mind to a state of complete rest and restoring wholeness to body and mind and curing all the ills of the body. And he gives to this young man, Charmides, that the dialogue is named for. He gives him a technique, and he says, Charmides has been having headaches. And he comes to Socrates and he talks about his headaches. And Socrates says, I'm going to give you a technique that will cure your headache. I'm going to give you an herb. But before you take the herb, I want to give you something to cure the mind, because you can't cure the body without first curing the mind. So I'm going to give you a technique to cure the mind and bring wholeness and health to the mind. And once you've brought wholeness and health to the mind, then the body will come along and it'll cure itself. So he tells him he's going to give him a fair word, and he's to repeat it every day until Socrates says he's had enough. A fair word to repeat every day, and it's going to bring wholeness to the body and mind and cure all ills and bring immortality and wisdom, which is understood as that state of life that enjoys infinite, unbounded, eternal, pure consciousness. So do I need to say more about Plato? It's just a taste. This is a 2-minute version of something that I've unpacked in great detail in the book, but you get some idea. Now to Aristotle. Now, as I said, Aristotle uses this word nous, and nous was the Greek word. It's usually translated as mind. Nous is mind, noein is thought, noesis is thinking. Now, the usual translations of Aristotle, if you read Aristotle, you'll see it was translated by people who never understood, who never got beyond the intellect and the thinking process to know that silence of being. But Aristotle is talking about a state which he says it again and again, it's simple, it's unchanging, it's eternal, and it knows itself, and this knower and the known are identical. Well, that's not thinking. That's not thought. That's not the mental activity that we experience before we transcend. He's talking about the state that we call pure consciousness. And here's some of the expressions properly translated that he uses. And I translate those three terms consistently as consciousness, conscious of, and being conscious. And when you translate them properly, Aristotle says, it is speaking of God or this internal self, he says it is that which is conscious of itself. Its consciousness is a consciousness of consciousness. And he talks about the divine consciousness and its object are not distinct but identical, and the consciousness is one with what it is conscious of. So it's self-knowing consciousness. What is conscious and what it is, and what is conscious and what it is conscious of are identical. It is pure, conscious of itself, and continuous. And Aristotle says, perfect consciousness apprehends itself and is conscious of its object in such a way that the consciousness and its object come to be one, and consciousness becomes its own object. Consciousness knowing itself. And he says, if God is in that good state in which we sometimes are, this impels our wonder. And if in a better state, this compels it yet more. So he's in a better state than even we are when we transcend. And I can only understand that as an expression of unity or an indication of unity. And he says, when the mind is freed from its present condition, it appears as just what it is and nothing more. And this alone is immortal and eternal. When the mind is set free from its present conditions, meaning activity, it is our only deathless and eternal part without which nothing is conscious. It is the deathless and eternal part of the self, separate from its lower functions. It is never moved, but remains at rest. Now, there is a term that you can take note of. At rest. It's consciousness at rest. Consciousness settled and still. He calls it bliss, and he says it surpasses all other activities in blessedness. He calls it supreme happiness, the most complete form of human happiness. He talks about it as unwearied diligence, untiring activity. And you remember, I'm sure you remember lectures where Maharishi talks about activity in cosmic consciousness doesn't tire you out. It gives more energy than it takes. It's a source of untiring activity and unwearied diligence. And when the mind is in that state, he says, it is not affected by impressions. And enjoy such a life as we enjoy in our best moments. So you see a glimpse there that Aristotle and Plato were talking about a state that's eternal and simple and unchanging and conscious of itself and blissful and at rest. A settled state of awareness that we enjoy in our best moments. So that's what the Greeks were really about. And these are not minor works. This is Aristotle's most important work. He called it the first science. That was his name for it. But because in the course of history, it got translated as the book after the physics, it came to be called the metaphysics. And metaphysics today has this horrible connotation in the universities as pure speculative thinking and conjecture and intellectual constructs and worldviews. And so that's how Plato and Aristotle are understood in the universities, as giving intellectual theories and constructs. And people think, well, Plato had his worldview and Aristotle had his worldview and everybody had their worldview. And so they were just, they weren't doing anything very important. And so the logical positivists in the early 20th century threw it all out and said, let's do science and forget about all this old stuff. And they threw it out. And it hasn't had a very esteemed place in the universities since, because even though there's still philosophers and people who do philosophy, it's not taken seriously as a source of knowledge. Now, what I want to say next is that this technique of transcending that Plato and Aristotle certainly learned it from Plato. The Greeks had a technique which is unmistakably a technique of turning within. That's the way Plato describes it. And where did it come from? I think there's only one real accurate answer. It came from the Vedic tradition. The Upanishads, the Katha Upanishad. Well, first of all, the Rig Veda, Nivarta Tvam, return, come back to the self. That was the classic expression. And the Upanishads, the Katha Upanishad. The self is not to be sought through the senses, for the senses look outward to the world beyond, outside, and not within to the self. What the Upanishads, like Plato and Aristotle, were about is a different way of knowing. Not by going out through the senses, but by coming back to the self, closing the eyes, settling the mind, settling the activity of the mind until the mind is awake in that state of eternal silence. There are levels of the mind very clearly distinguished in the Upanishads. Beyond the senses, deeper than the senses, are the objects of the senses. And beyond the objects of the senses is the mind. And beyond the mind is the intellect. And beyond the intellect is the self in man, the individual ego. Beyond the self in man is the unmanifest self of the universe. So if we just go within and go deeper and deeper and deeper within, we come to that eternal silence of the universal self that Plato and Aristotle and all the others were talking about. And the Yoga Sutras is the classic expression. You know it well. In this complete settling of all activity of the mind, all is calmed, and what remains is unbounded wakefulness. There was a technique, a method of knowledge. The Vedic tradition was not a way to relax. It was not about relaxation. I mean, sure, you get relaxation, but it was a method of knowledge. And the knowledge that it was about is the knowledge of that inner self that's eternal and unbounded. We can call it God. We can call it the highest self. We can call it cosmic intelligence. We can call it it's called by dozens of names. But what enables us to say that that these different people in different traditions were talking about the same thing, the same experience, the same state of unbounded eternal oneness, is that they all use the same terms to describe it, that same set of terms. So the same expressions are found in the Vedic tradition. Retire, return to the self from the Rig Veda. Settle the activity of the mind from the Yoga Sutras. Withdraw from the outer. Come back to the self. In the Upanishads, go deep within. Bring the mind to a state of rest and silence. Collect the self within itself. Know the self in solitude. Close the eyes and be still. Unite with the divine. This was the essence of the Vedic tradition, and it spread throughout the ancient world. And I found expressions of it in Australian Aboriginals and New Zealand Maori, and in Eskimos north of the Arctic Circle, and of Mayan Indians and Aztec Indians. In every tradition, every culture practically, the American Indians describe it just as clearly as you'd want to find. In their own simple language. The Mayan Indians talk about the state before the world was created. And it says there were no waves. No waves. No activity. Just silence, and the ocean was still. There are many ways of talking about it, many ways of describing it, but they all describe essentially the same state of eternal, unchanging silence. So this gives us an entirely new perspective on ancient philosophy. Philosophy was not speculative thinking. It wasn't conjecture and worldviews. The ancient Greeks were describing the experience of eternal, pure consciousness that's experienced in transcending. So that's a brief glimpse. Plotinus and Proclus went so deeply into the self-interacting dynamics of consciousness as Maharishi has described it. They describe how in knowing itself, consciousness interacts with itself, and the knower and the known interact with themselves to give rise to the diversity of the universe. It's found in the ancient Chaldean oracles and the mysteries of ancient Egypt, the so-called Hermetic tradition. It's found everywhere that you find classical writings and classical literature. So what was the secret of ancient Greece? Well, there was a secret. And it's very simple. The Greeks had learned how to transcend. And they practiced it. And I'm going to tell you in just a second what that secret, how that practice got spread to so many people in Greece that you find this magnificent outburst of sculpture and creativity. Here I want to mention this lady here who you probably have never heard of before. The goddess Hezekiah. She was the goddess of silence, stillness, and rest. You've heard of most of the other Greek deities, but probably not Hezekiah. Well, Hezekiah was the goddess of silence, stillness, and rest. The way the techniques of transcending came into Greece, scholars say that the mystery religions came into Greece in the early 6th century BCE from the east. They don't specify where in the east, but somewhere in the east. And the mysteries of Eleusis, which had been around for hundreds of years, thousands of years maybe. Eleusis is a little town 11 miles south of Athens with a big cave. And the cave inside is a big wide-mouthed cave, and there's a ledge in the cave that's been worn smooth by people sitting on it a long time. The mysteries of Eleusis were the main way I suggest, I would propose that the techniques of transcending were passed on in Greece. And there were initiation processions from Athens to Eleusis in September of every year that involved about 25,000 people, or about half the population of Athens. And new people were taken to Eleusis to be initiated into the mystery of Eleusis. About 8 of the most significant Roman emperors had been initiated, including Pericles was initiated, and the 3 great dramatists, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, all had been initiated. Sophocles was a mystery priest. The mysteries were the way that the technique of transcending, I think, came into existence. Came to be widespread. The practice of transcending came to be widespread in Greece. During the reign of during the governorship of Pericles, the great governor general of Athens, whose name is associated with the glory of the golden age of Greece, the Periclean age. Pericles built the Parthenon and protected Greece through a supreme strategy against of all sorts of invasions from the Persians. And during his reign, he had a new temple constructed at Eleusis. It was 50 meters by 50 meters. Huge temple, the size of a football field practically. Half of a football field at least, but wider. And I asked myself again and again, what was this huge temple used for? I found one scholar, very well-known scholar and very highly respected, who said that after initiation, the initiates would sit in silence on their sacred sheepskins. Where did they sit? Partly in the caves. Part of this huge temple was built in the side of a large rock mountain so that it was completely silent. It was like being in a cave. The caves at Eleusis were very significant. And Aristotle's school in Macedonia, where he instructed Alexander, was built next to a cave. And King Minos gave his laws to Crete from a meditation cave. And King Zalmoxis of Thrace gave the fair words that Plato learned and Socrates learned from a cave that he had built under his palace. Caves were very significant in the early history of Greece. They were valued for their silence. They were a place to transcend in ease. And we know you can meditate without complete silence, and that noise is no barrier, but the Greeks knew that it helped. It helps to have a good silent cave. And I haven't said much about Socrates. Here's a passage from Plato's Symposium which describes his and now Socrates, there burst upon the initiate into the mysteries that wondrous vision of the very soul of beauty that he has toiled so long for. It is an everlasting loveliness that neither comes nor goes, subsisting by itself in an eternal oneness. The eternal oneness is exactly what the Greeks, almost all the Greeks, from the earliest pre-Socratics right through Proclus in 585 AD, we're talking about eternal oneness. Now, most people try to imagine what oneness is, and so they form a picture of a white ball on a black background or something. In the universities, I found that when I was a student and I heard about oneness, I just tried to picture it as a white ball on a black background. It's not on the level of sight that the oneness is known. It's by going beyond sight, beyond thinking, beyond intellect, beyond ego, beyond everything, all activity, until you transcend everything. So, I've talked enough, and I could go on and on. I love it, but I want to have some questions, and I think the key to this whole thing, transcend. That's what the Greeks did, and that's how the Golden Age was created. The Periclean age. Plato says of Pericles, by the way, that Plato says he thought Pericles had attained to that state of eternal self-knowledge. He had arrived. He was a realized man. He was known throughout Greece as a great speaker, a great general, everything about him is preserved by history as a pristine reputation. And how did the Greeks rise to such height, this brilliant 5th century BCE? Through a practice of transcending. So that's the long and short of it. So thank you.